My wife and I are having a tough time because of nevrotic brother-in-law. I have just made the difficult decision to cancel our vacation halfway through, an act that has thrown a spotlight on the dynamics of my wife's family and the turmoil they bring. The catalyst for this abrupt end was the completely unacceptable behavior of my brother-in-law, a man whose explosive temperament and controlling tendencies have plagued my relationship with my wife since the very beginning. Now, in the aftermath, the intensity of my wife's reaction has shaken me in ways I could not have anticipated. Currently, we are in a country where my brother-in-law and his wife live with their 3 small children. My wife, our young daughter, and I had arrived with hopes of a warm family reunion. It was supposed to be a pleasant getaway, a rare chance for the cousins to bond, for us to relax as a family. We had only been here for a few days, but the cracks in the foundation of this so-called family vacation became evident almost immediately. It wasn't just that the tensions were palpable, it was as though they were woven into the very fabric of this family's interactions. From the moment I began dating my wife 5 years ago, her brother has loomed large in the background. He's been critical, cold, and overbearing from day one. It was as if my mere presence in his sister's life was an affront, a trespass he could not tolerate. The hostility was immediate and unapologetic. It wasn't the sort of protective skepticism you might expect from an older brother. No, it was something far more antagonistic, almost territorial. My wife and her brother share a history that is as painful as it is complex. They grew up in a household overshadowed by their father's alcoholism. Their mother, a woman of unrelenting strength and sacrifice, did everything she could to shield them from the worst of it, but even her efforts were not enough to spare them entirely. My wife carries the emotional scars of those years, scars that manifest in ways she can't always articulate but that are as real as any physical wound. Amid the chaos, her brother stepped into a role he was far too young to take on. With their mother often stretched to her limits, he became a sort of surrogate father figure, though he was only 4 years older than my wife. I can see now that his intentions were noble. He wanted to protect her, to provide the stability their father never could. But there's a fine line between protection and control, and he crossed it early on. The stories I've heard about their childhood make my heart ache for both of them. My wife has told me about the times her brother would step in when boys showed an interest in her, about the threats and even physical confrontations he initiated to keep her safe. On the surface, it might seem like the actions of a dutiful older brother, but there was an intensity to his behavior that went beyond what could be considered reasonable or healthy. He wasn't just protecting her, he was policing her. It was as if he saw every interaction she had with the opposite sex as a threat not just to her, but to his own sense of control. I can understand, to an extent, why he felt the need to step into that role. Their father, the man who should have been their rock, was instead the source of their instability and fear. But even understanding doesn't make it easier to stomach the ways those patterns of control have carried over into adulthood. Now, years later, we're all supposedly grown ups, building lives of our own. But every time we visit, every time we're in his orbit, I see my wife transform before my eyes. The confident, intelligent, independent woman I know becomes someone else entirely, someone quieter, smaller, almost childlike. It's as if being around her brother reverts her to the vulnerable girl she once was, the one who needed him to shield her from the chaos of their childhood. I've asked her about it more times than I can count. Why do you act this way around him? I'll say, desperate for some insight, but her answers, if she gives them, are never satisfying. I don't think she fully understands it herself. And so, every vacation, every family gathering, becomes a delicate balancing act. His criticisms come sharp and fast, his interrogations relentless. Why are you doing this? Why don't you let her do that? He'll demand, always implying that I'm somehow failing her, failing as a husband. It doesn't matter how much love, respect, and freedom I give my wife. In his eyes, I am always falling short, always doing something wrong. His accusations are baseless, but they cut just the same. Yet even this isn't the worst of it. The true issue lies in his temperament, the unpredictable, often explosive behavior that terrorizes everyone around him. It's not just my wife who bears the brunt of it. His own family, his wife, and his children walk on eggshells around him. This man, who once tried to protect his sister from harm, has become the source of so much fear and instability in his own home. It's a bitter irony, one that came to a head during this trip in the most alarming way. Yesterday, his temper erupted in front of all the children, including our daughter. It was a moment that will stay with me for a long time, not just because of the fear it caused, but because it was the breaking point, the moment I realized I could no longer subject my family to his volatile presence. So here we are, adults, navigating the complexities of our lives, striving to build something stable and fulfilling. Yet, despite the years that have passed and the physical miles between us, her brother's shadow looms large. It's as though time has stood still in his eyes, and his role as the self-appointed gatekeeper of my wife's life remains unwavering. He is not just present, he is an omnipresent force, dictating, criticizing, and judging every decision, every move. Whenever we meet, whether it's for a holiday, a family celebration, or just a casual visit, the transformation in my wife is instantaneous and unmistakable. The confident, capable woman I adore becomes someone I barely recognize. It's not just that she defers to him, it's deeper, more troubling than that. She becomes almost childlike, her posture shrinking, her voice softer, her demeanor hesitant. It's as if she reverts to the little girl she once was, the one who depended on her brother for protection in a chaotic, unstable world. I've tried to understand this phenomenon, tried to reach her in those moments. I've asked her countless times, why do you act like this around him? Why do you let him control you this way? But her responses are either vague or non-existent. Sometimes, she seems genuinely confused by the question, as if she doesn't even realize the shift is happening. Other times, she brushes it off, saying, that's just how we are, as though their dynamic is some immutable law of nature. Over the years, we've had many encounters with him, most of them during vacations or family gatherings. And every single time, it's the same story. He sits there, his eyes narrowed, his tone dripping with condescension, firing off questions like a prosecutor in a courtroom. Why don't you let my sister do this? Why are you treating her like that? The insinuation is clear. He believes I'm controlling her, restricting her, failing her in some way. To be objective, I've always taken a step back to reflect on his accusations. Am I giving my wife the freedom she deserves? Am I treating her with the love and respect she needs? The answer, every time, is a resounding yes. I love her deeply, and I show it in every way I can. I support her dreams, encourage her independence, and strive to be the partner she deserves. But in his eyes, I am always the villain, the one who is never good enough. But even his constant accusations and needling are not the worst of it. No, the real issue, the one that leaves a lasting impact, is his behavior. His neurotic, volatile nature doesn't just affect my wife and me, it terrorizes everyone around him. His wife, a woman who seems to have long since resigned herself to this existence, walks on eggshells, her every move calculated to avoid setting him off. His children, young and innocent, are already learning to tiptoe around their father's temper, their laughter often silenced by his outbursts. And then, there's my daughter. Our sweet, bright-eyed girl who had no choice but to witness the chaos he unleashed yesterday. It started innocently enough. His son, a spirited little boy, was playing with a toy. Perhaps he got a bit too rough, as children often do, and hit his father with it. What happened next was nothing short of horrifying. His reaction was not one of a frustrated parent setting boundaries. It was an eruption of uncontrolled rage. He grabbed his son, lifting him off the ground, and screamed at him, over and over, his voice echoing through the house like a thunderclap. The room fell silent, save for the sound of frightened children crying. My daughter clung to me, her little body trembling, her wide eyes filled with fear. His wife looked down, her hands wringing nervously. Even my wife, who is so accustomed to his outbursts, seemed shaken. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I could not, would not, allow this man's toxic behavior to continue poisoning my family. Still, I held my composure. At the dinner table later, I kept my cool, though every fiber of my being was screaming to address what had just happened. Once the meal was over, I saw my chance. I approached him one-on-one, determined to address the situation calmly but firmly. "Your behavior earlier," I said, my voice steady but laced with anger, "was completely unacceptable. You should have handled that differently. Discipline your son, yes, but not in a way that terrifies all the children in the room. They had nothing to do with it, and you scared them." He stared at me, his gaze cold and unyielding. There was no recognition of his wrongdoing, no hint of remorse. Instead, he doubled down, launching into a tirade about how I had no right to tell him how to discipline his child. His words came fast and furious, laced with accusations that had nothing to do with the incident at hand. It was as if he had been storing up every grievance, every perceived slight, and now saw his chance to unleash them all. I stood my ground, deflecting his baseless accusations one by one. This was not the first time I had faced his wrath, and I had no illusions about changing his mind or winning him over. But I could no longer stay silent, not after what had happened. My wife and his wife eventually joined the conversation, timidly confirming that his behavior had indeed been out of line. Yet even their hesitant support seemed to embolden him further, his anger growing with every passing second. By the end of the exchange, it was clear that no resolution would be reached. He left the room with the same defiance he had entered it with, leaving behind a wake of tension and unease. And though I felt a small sense of vindication for having stood up to him, it was overshadowed by the weight of what lay ahead. This was not just about him anymore. It was about my wife, my daughter, and the question of how we could move forward as a family in the face of his toxicity. Well, I stood my ground. For every accusation he hurled, I met it head-on, refusing to be drawn into the emotional whirlwind he so often thrived on. This wasn't the first time I had faced his ire, nor would it be the last. Over the years, I had learned to weather his storms for the sake of my wife, who, despite everything, still longed for some semblance of family connection. Each encounter left me drained, but I endured, hoping that perhaps, with time, things might improve. But now, I knew there was no more enduring. A line had to be drawn. After the confrontation, my wife, our daughter, and I retreated to the quiet of our vacation rental. The tension clung to us like an unwelcome guest, heavy and suffocating. My wife was visibly upset, her sadness etched into every line of her face. I could feel the weight of it too, the frustration, the helplessness, the ache of a family fractured by one man's unchecked anger. "It simply doesn't work," I told her softly, trying to keep my voice steady despite the maelstrom of emotions inside me. "I can't let him behave like that in front of our daughter. It's not safe, and it's not fair to her." She nodded, her agreement tentative but there. For a moment, I thought we were on the same page, that she understood the necessity of creating boundaries for the sake of our family. But as the night wore on and the following day dawned, her tone began to shift. What had been agreement turned into something murkier, more conflicted. "He was just saying, 'Don't hit me,' to his son," she said, her voice uncertain but insistent. I stared at her, disbelief washing over me like a cold tide. "He was screaming at the top of his lungs," I replied, struggling to keep the frustration from my tone. "He terrified everyone in that room, including our daughter. That's not just saying, 'Don't hit me.'" But she didn't stop there. Her next words hit me like a punch to the gut. "It feels like you want to see him suffer," she said quietly, almost as if testing the accusation. The sheer absurdity of it made my anger flare. What kind of pleasure could I possibly get from this? I demanded, my voice rising despite myself. "Do you think I enjoy seeing your brother mess up? Seeing him hurt his own family? Do you think I want to be at odds with him? She didn't have an answer, and her silence spoke volumes. It wasn't just the accusation that stung, it was the fact that she seemed so conflicted, so unable to see the situation for what it truly was. Her loyalty to her brother, as misguided as it might be, was clouding her judgment, and it was tearing me apart. As the day went on, she decided to go back to her brother and his family. She said she needed to see them, to talk things through. I didn't stop her. How could I? She had her own decisions to make, her own relationships to navigate. Meanwhile, I took our daughter out to the park, determined to shield her from the fallout as much as possible. We played on the swings, fed the ducks, and for a few brief moments, I managed to push the chaos from my mind. Later, when we returned to the rental, we made dinner together, our little routine offering a semblance of normalcy. But the peace was short-lived. My wife arrived not long after, her brother in tow. He was the last person I wanted to see, his presence a dark cloud that instantly shifted the atmosphere. "My brother wants to speak to you," my wife said, her voice cautious. I didn't even have to think about my answer. "No," I said firmly. "I don't want to speak to him." But he wasn't the type to take no for an answer. Moments later, there he was, standing at the door, his expression set in that familiar, unyielding scowl. He didn't wait for an invitation, launching into his grievances the moment he saw me. It was as though no time had passed since our last confrontation. He picked up right where he had left off, his accusations and justifications spilling out in a torrent of words. This time, I didn't let him get far. "If you don't leave in 3 seconds, I said, my voice low and deliberate, "I will call the police." My words stopped him in his tracks, if only for a moment. He stared at me, his eyes filled with disbelief and anger, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't going to let him intimidate me, not this time. After a beat, he spat out his parting shot. "Your wife is very disappointed in you," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. I didn't let him have the last word. "Yesterday, your wife told us she was living in terror every day," I said, my voice steady but pointed. "She told us your parents are afraid of you. That's what your behavior does to the people around you." His face darkened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and left, the tension lingering in the air long after the door had closed behind him. I stood there for a moment, my hands shaking slightly, the weight of the confrontation settling over me. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the fractures in my own family, the way his toxicity was seeping into our lives and threatening to tear us apart. I knew, then and there, that something had to change. I have given this far too many chances. Time and again, I have allowed myself to believe that things might be different, that somehow the years and the circumstances would create space for growth and understanding. Each time, I've stepped into these family gatherings with cautious optimism, convincing myself that perhaps this time, it could work. But I see now how naive that hope was. This was the breaking point. Enough was enough. As I sat down with my wife later that evening, the weight of everything we had endured during this trip pressing down on me, I knew I couldn't keep pretending that this dynamic was sustainable. "This man is unsafe and unstable," I said, my voice steady but laced with resolve. "I don't want him anywhere near our daughter again." My wife listened, her face a mixture of sadness and frustration. But instead of agreement, what came next felt like a knife to the heart. "You don't want peace," she said, her voice tinged with accusation. "You find comfort in his misery." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unfounded, and I struggled to understand how she could see things this way. What kind of comfort could I possibly find in this mess? I finally managed, my voice tinged with both hurt and anger. "Do you think I enjoy watching him hurt everyone around him? Do you think I want to be the one drawing these lines, making these decisions?" She didn't respond directly, her silence more telling than any argument. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the way her loyalty to her brother pulled against the reality of his actions. It wasn't that she didn't see the harm he caused, she did. But the bond they shared, forged in the crucible of their painful childhood, made it nearly impossible for her to break away. Despite her conflicted feelings, I knew what I had to do. "We can't stay here," I told her, my tone leaving no room for debate. "This isn't just about us anymore, it's about our daughter. I won't let her grow up thinking this kind of behavior is normal." And so, with a heavy heart, I booked tickets for the next day. I knew the decision would hurt some people, that it might even fracture relationships further. But I also knew it was the right thing to do. Staying would only mean exposing my family to more chaos, more instability. I couldn't allow that, not for my wife, not for my daughter, and not for myself. As we prepared to leave, the situation took another turn. My wife received a text from her brother, its contents both manipulative and deeply troubling. "I will poison myself," it read, among other similar threats. It was a blatant attempt to pull her back into his web of control, to make her feel responsible for his actions. I saw the anxiety in her face as she read the message, the way it tightened her shoulders and clouded her expression. "This is exactly what I mean," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "He's manipulating you, emotionally blackmailing you to keep you under his thumb." "But he's my brother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words carried the weight of a lifetime of shared history, of a bond that was both her greatest strength and her deepest vulnerability. "I can't just turn my back on him." "If he robbed a bank, you'd defend him," I said, not unkindly but with the bluntness the situation demanded. "But this isn't about turning your back. It's about protecting yourself and our family from his toxicity." She didn't answer, and I didn't push her further. I knew she was struggling, caught between her loyalty to her brother and her understanding of the harm he caused. It was a position I wouldn't wish on anyone, and I didn't envy her for it. But I also couldn't let her indecision dictate the safety and stability of our lives. As we packed our things, the enormity of the situation weighed heavily on me. The issue wasn't just her brother. That part, as far as I was concerned, was dealt with. We were leaving, and I had no intention of exposing my family to his volatility again. But the deeper problem lay within my own home, in the rift his presence had created between my wife and me. She felt like I was forcing her away from her family, like I was asking her to make an impossible choice. And in a way, I understood her perspective. Her brother wasn't just a sibling to her, he was a symbol of survival, a reminder of the times they had weathered together. But what she couldn't or wouldn't see was that my intentions were never about separation or punishment. They were about safety, stability, and peace. I've always gotten along well with her other family members, and that makes this situation even more frustrating. It's not about her family as a whole, it's about this one man, this singular force of chaos and destruction. But trying to make her see that feels like an uphill battle, one I'm not sure I know how to win. As we left the area the next morning, the tension between us was palpable. My wife was quiet, her thoughts a mystery, while our daughter, blissfully unaware of the deeper undercurrents, chattered happily about going home. I couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead for us. Would this be the turning point, the moment where things began to heal? Or would it be the beginning of a deeper divide? For now, my focus is on keeping our small family intact. I know it won't be easy. Talking to my wife about her brother feels like walking a tightrope, every word a potential misstep. She is so easily swayed by other voices, especially his, and I fear that his influence will continue to cast a shadow over our lives. But I also know this: I cannot, and will not, allow his behavior to drag us into chaos any longer. My responsibility is to my wife, my daughter, and the life we are building together. And if standing my ground means weathering some difficult conversations and strained relationships, so be it. In the end, I can only hope that time and clarity will bring us to a better place,